Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 4. I'm going to pick up where we left last week with, like Dad said, with the calling of the disciples, the first disciples. So we're going to be talking about this call to follow Jesus. And just like the lyrics we sang tonight, it's pretty serious. This is one of those things that is... it's significant. It's a very small passage, but I found myself wrestling so much this week with whether or not I'm following Jesus, whether or not I'm obeying Jesus. And so I want to think just at the beginning, what do you think of when you think of a follower? When I was in college at orientation, they have these orientation aides that lead all the freshmen around, and for whatever reason at William & Mary, they thought it was hilarious to put them all in yellow t-shirts. So you have these like freshmen in yellow t-shirts walking like behind like their little mama duck, you know? And you just get, because everyone's lost. No one knows what's what or where's anything. And so you just look like you're playing a little follow the leader. Or as a youth pastor back in the day, when we would go to camp, we would caravan to camp, you know? So, you know, we'd have sometimes as many as 80 people in all these vans, because MFuge makes you take vans, right? Amen, MFuge. Yeah, exactly. There it is. And we would have these little walkie-talkies, and everyone's just following. And so they stopped putting me at the front because, you know, I just want to get there on time. That's what my excuse was. I think others said I drove too fast. And so you'd be following each other. Or in our modern, contemporary time, the word follow is used constantly on social media with Twitter, right? How many followers do you have? One time, I got recommended to follow the account Jesus on Twitter, and I was like, I felt really torn between like sacrilegious and like, well, I better follow him, right? Like I can't say I'm not following Jesus, so I did, and just to be safe, you know. But I think the best example that I see of following in my day-to-day life are children. They are imitators by nature, and that's what frustrates me about my kids the most, is because the things that they are the worst at are the things that I'm the worst at. The things that they do that drive me crazy are usually the things about myself that drive me crazy, because they're imitating. As we say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and my mom will often remind me that if I had been born first, there wouldn't have been a second. And then she didn't pray for revenge, but we got it sometimes, right? But so we're looking at, what does it mean to follow Christ? What does it mean to imitate him? And so we're looking at discipleship. Now, the word disciple doesn't occur till Matthew chapter 5, but this is the start of the disciples following Jesus and our understanding of what does it mean to be a disciple, which we know is key to the message of Jesus, because his final marching orders in Matthew 28 are go and make disciples. So he starts here with discipleship, and we end with the command that we should go and make disciples. But the word follower, which I think is rich and powerful in Scripture, feels so tame in our culture. When I think of follower, I think of someone who's very passive. Like following does not seem to be a very active activity in the way we use it. But in discipleship, following is an all-in with your entire life sort of thing. I heard one preacher describe the difference in a disciple and what we normally are as the difference between a fan of a team and someone who's on a team. Right, so we use this language all the time. You know, you like a certain sports team, and you're like, oh, we scored a lot the other day. And you're like, you wore a jersey and ate nachos on the couch. Like, we didn't do anything, right? For a lot of people, Jesus is just like Team Jesus, right? Like we wear like a T-shirt, like a Jesus T-shirt, and we're like share an inspirational meme every now and then, like a fan would. Like we're fans of Jesus. But when it comes to actually getting in the game, we're like, no, I belong here on the sidelines. If you think of the difference between a fan of a sport and someone who's actually on the team, it's sacrifice. We're talking about, like, let's just go with football, right? We're talking about working out, eating right, disciplining your body for your entire life, sacrificing summers, time at school, watching these Division I athletes in college. They do nothing but sports, right? That's their entire life. But we think that somehow we can be like on Team Jesus and like cheer him on from the sidelines, and we don't actually have to get in the game. And that's not what discipleship is. Discipleship in the Bible is about conforming our entire lives to God's agenda. Rather than just getting him to bless our plan, we actually follow behind him everywhere he leads and everything he tells us to do. In the book Radical by David Platt, which kind of went through its heyday, I don't know if it's back again or not, but he makes this funny observation. He says, Jesus wasn't known for crowd-pleasing sermons, but what he calls space maker sermons. Right? So when we think of preachers, we want you to like do well so that more people show up next week till the place is full. We got to add a service, then we can go multi-site, and pretty soon we can be beaming your message around the world. But for Jesus, he would get all these crowds to show up. They would all be there hanging on his every word. Then he would say things like this in John 6. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. It's not like the best church growth tactic. Right? They're like, we don't need the vampire sermon, Jesus. Can you just, the disciples are like, a little bit less cannibalism, a little bit more like your best life now. But Jesus apparently wasn't interested in marketing himself to the masses. His invitations to followers involved a cost that most of the crowds were not ready to accept. And he seemed to be just fine with that. He focused instead on a few who would follow him radically with their entire lives. And through their obedience, he turned the whole course of history in a new direction. John Piper says this: after 3 years of ministry, Jesus had somewhere around 120 followers. That's not a successful church plant by today's standards. He would lose his NAM funding. My favorite book on discipleship, called The Cost of Discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says this: when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. It may be a death like that of the first disciples who had to leave home and work to follow him, or it might be another death like Martin Luther, who had to leave the monastery and go out into the world. But it is the same death every time. Death in Jesus Christ, the death of the old man at his call. Jesus' summons to the rich young ruler was calling him to die, because only the man who is dead to his own will can follow Christ. In fact, every command of Jesus is a call to die with all of our affections and our lust. And so I've been wrestling with this call to Jesus, and as I come to this text, I think this is the point that I'm trying to get across: that Jesus is worth following. Anywhere, at any cost, Jesus is worth following. So here's what it says in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 22. It says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. This isn't a long passage, but there's a lot packed into there. So we're just going to look at some of the principles and some of the actions that occur in this passage as we consider what does it mean for us to follow Jesus. So the first thing we see is that Jesus calls us to follow him. In both instances, with Peter and Andrew and with James and John, Jesus tells them to follow him. He calls them, he says, follow me, or come after me. Just in general, it is significant to think that Jesus' first act in ministry is not to go out and start this mega ministry. It's to call people to follow him, to gather a group of people to join him on that mission. That from here on out, we don't see Jesus doing things, but Jesus and his disciples doing things. And in fact, we as his disciples are called to carry out the mission of Jesus. We are his ambassadors. He is making his appeal through us. Scripture talks about this all the time. Paul tells Timothy, share in my sufferings for the gospel by the power of God. Or he tells him elsewhere, he says, fill up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ, which we know there's nothing lacking in Christ's sacrifice. What he's saying is, make visible, you're the visible representation of Jesus' work in the world. That Jesus doesn't go out and sort of duck, duck, goose and pick people to go to heaven. Instead, he gathers us and sends us out. It's crazy to think that he wants to use us, that he calls us to follow him in that. Like I said, the word disciple doesn't occur yet. It occurs later in Matthew chapter 5, and it's all through the Gospels. But it's the concept is clearly here. In this spot, it says follow me, but I think a better, maybe more colloquial way to say it, he says, come here. Get over here. Come here. And he says, come behind me. Get behind me. Walk behind me. Follow the steps that I'm walking in. So if you were to live in the first century and you were to go learn under a teacher, a rabbi, you would literally walk in the path of that rabbi. But there's something very different about Jesus here than the other rabbis. If you wanted to study under a rabbi in the first century, you would sort of look around and you would find the rabbi that you liked best. It's not very different than if you were to get a doctorate degree here in the States. You find the professor you want to study under, and you go ask him, hey, can I study under you? And they either say yes or no. So it's totally different for Jesus to go and find people to study, to follow after him. Jesus doesn't wait for people to come to him. He goes out and calls them. He pursues them. In fact, the most famous word follow in the Bible, I think, outside of this follow me here, is in Psalm 23. When I learned it in the King James when I was a kid. And so when I quote Psalm 23, I sort of mesh it into a bunch of English translations that have a lot of like walketh and, leadeth me, all that sort of stuff. But towards the end of it, it says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me. It's a terrible translation in English because what we think is like God's just sort of like chilling out behind us. But the real word there is pursue me. Surely goodness and mercy will pursue me, will chase me down. 1 John 4, we love not because we first loved him, but because he first loved us. The story in Luke 15, when one sheep runs away, Jesus leaves the 99 and hunts down the one. He goes after the one. He pursues us. Jesus is not passively waiting for you to follow him. He is passionately pursuing you and calling you to follow him. And we look at their response. The call to follow requires immediate action, both in verse 20 and in verse 22. After they receive the call, it says they immediately left their nets, or they immediately left the boat. Immediately, without delay, without hesitation, they immediately follow him. I think there's two aspects to this. One is the immediacy, and the other is the action of following. One of my friends, who is, I think, one of the best parents in the world, his kids are just perfectly well behaved, but one of the phrases in their house was, delayed obedience is disobedience. Yeah, there was a lot of head nods, like maybe we got a pop or two for not obeying that one, right? For some reason, we know that with children, but when it comes to with God, we're like, he can wait. And I'm not trying to make this so black and white. I understand how difficult it is to obey the call of God. But I also don't want us to justify our inaction. A lot of times when we say we'll pray about it, what we mean is we're not ready. When we say, let me think about it, what we mean is I'm just not ready to obey yet. The rich young ruler, which I've already talked about once and Dad mentioned as we were singing those songs, that's what's at stake here. It's not that we don't know what we have to do. It's that we're unwilling to do it. Most of us don't need new revelation from God. We need to obey what we already know. Most of us are not struggling with what to do, but rather if we will do it. I believe that every one of us, at some point or another, maybe at many points in our life, are going to have a rich young ruler moment. At some point, Jesus is going to point to your most valued possession on earth and ask, do you love me more than this? And these disciples responded immediately to the call. Now, I don't want you to think, well, you've missed your opportunity to obey Jesus, because the best time to obey Jesus is now. Right? If you have been holding out on obeying what Jesus is calling you to do, today is the day to obey. But there is this problem of paralysis by analysis, right? Where you sit and you think and you worry and you fret instead of just simply obeying. You might get it wrong. I would rather you do something than do nothing. It's one of the reasons we have an invitation every week, not because we think it's super spiritual, that God somehow only works here and doesn't work elsewhere. We do think that God has designed the gathered worship for us to meet Him, to be challenged by His Spirit, to be convicted of sin. But here's why I think practically we do the invitation every week. Because I'd rather you deal with what God's doing through His Word by His Spirit now than walk out the door. Because a lot of times if we can just get out of here, we can just if we can just kind of white knuckle the proverbial pews and we can just move on, then by the time we get outside, we're like, okay, I don't have to deal with it for another week. That's why we want to deal with it now. And so in this case, they didn't wait till they were done fishing. They didn't wait till they had tied up their boats. They didn't wait till they had gotten their affairs in order. It says they immediately left it to follow Him. Trust involves not knowing everything that lies ahead, but following Christ immediately and wholeheartedly. One of the problems that a lot of us have is that we are dissatisfied with where we are in our obedience and walk with Christ, but we keep doing the same thing over and over again. If you do the same thing, you get the same results. And so you show up year after year, week after week, going, I wish I would share my faith more, or I wish I would read my Bible more, or I wish I would. Well, if we do the same things, we're going to get the same results. So if Jesus is calling you to do something different, then it's time to immediately act on it. To take that step of leaving the boat and following Him. If you look at the sequence of the disciples coming to meet Jesus, it's a little bit unclear, because you read here in Matthew 4, this call to follow, and they immediately left. But if you go over to the Gospel of John in John chapter 1, we find out that they've actually, it seems to indicate that they were aware of Jesus ahead of this. That maybe they'd heard Him preach, that maybe they'd heard Him teach, that there was some knowledge about Jesus going around. And that it's most likely, based on John 1, that they already believed that He was the Messiah. And so we see this difference between belief and obedience. It's one thing to believe that Jesus is who He says He is. It's another to walk in the path that He calls you to walk. There are a lot of people who call Jesus Lord. There are a lot of people who call Jesus Savior. There are a lot of people who call themselves Christians who do not obey Jesus. And He has strong words for them. He says later in the Gospel of Luke, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. One commentator says this: the question isn't simply, do we have a good grasp of theology, but has theology a good grasp of us? Pastor James and I have been talking a lot about discipleship, and one of the things that we are narrowing down in our own definition is this: that if it's going to be genuine discipleship, then it genuinely must change us. It must transform us. That you can't encounter Jesus and be the same. That if you can, then you're not really walking in the path of Jesus. You're not really submitting your life to Jesus. I'm not trying to minimize what we believe, because you can't obey until you believe. But belief is not enough. That belief must always lead to obedience if it's going to be genuine, if it's going to be real conversion, if it's going to be transformation of your life. And so they knew that Jesus had the authority that when He commanded them to follow, they would obey. That because He was who He says He was, the Messiah, God become flesh, the one who could speak and the wind and the waves would obey, that all authority in heaven and on earth belonged to Him, that when He said, follow me, He was the one who was worth following. Discipleship means adhering to Christ, And because Christ is the object of that adherence, it must take the form of discipleship. An abstract belief in Christ, a doctrinal system, a general religious knowledge on the subject of grace or forgiveness of sins make discipleship superfluous. I almost couldn't say it. I just had like a little mini stroke or something. Superfluous. Right? They render it ineffective. In fact, they exclude any idea of discipleship whatever. That if you believe something but cannot walk in it, then it's not real belief. That it's hypocrisy. That mental assent can't replace personal obedience. The Apostle James puts it this way: what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if a person claims to have faith, belief, or trust, but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother is without clothes and food. If one of you says to him, "Go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Our positive feelings toward Jesus are not enough. Sympathy is no substitute for action. You can't claim Christianity if you're not obeying Christ. Do not ask the Lord to guide your footsteps if you're not willing to move your feet. These disciples didn't understand everything, but they understood enough to trust Jesus. I was reading the story of a tragic story of a young pilot who had just gotten his pilot's license, and he was cleared to fly, but he hadn't been approved to fly by instruments. So he could only fly visually. Which means that he needed to be able to see the horizon. He needed to be able to have good visibility. And so he was about to take off, and his flight got delayed. And he waited and waited, and he should have just not flown. But instead, he took off after dark. And so eventually, he never made it to his destination. They found that his plane had crashed into the ocean. And what the investigators determined, that because of his inexperience, his lack of experience led him to trust what he thought he saw rather than what the instrument panel was telling him. Because he had no visible horizon, he got disoriented and crashed. Contrast this with another young pilot who was coming in to land his private plane on a cloudy day. He's not experienced in landing with the instruments yet, and the control tower is telling him what to do. And he radios back to the control tower, and they can hear that he's panicking in his voice. So they come over the radio and they say this: "You just obey our instructions, we'll take care of the obstructions. You just listen to us and we will take care of it. We walk by faith, not by sight." This means we trust God more than we trust our feelings, our circumstances. We trust him and we obey where he tells us to go. So Jesus calls us to follow him. The call to follow requires immediate action, and the call to follow involves everything. Look at what they left in verse 20. It says they left their nets and followed him. Or in verse 22, it says they left their boat and their father and followed him. Discipleship requires everything of us. Nothing is left untouched by the call to follow Jesus. Every part of our life is impacted by our following of him. Both sets of disciples left their careers, and at least here we see that one left his father, their family. Christ demands that we give up those things that keep us from following him. I had a friend in seminary. He was originally born in Cambodia, and he grew up in North Carolina. He came to the U.S. when he was 8 years old. His family grew up under the reign of a famous dictator in Cambodia called Pol Pot, famously known for the killing fields. Actually, this young boy was raped by Cambodian soldiers when he was 6-7 years old. And so when they left Cambodia, he said, I'm never going back there. And he grew up in kind of the country of North Carolina, which is hilarious when he has a Chinese mother, a Cambodian father, and he grew up in North Carolina, so his accent was confused. If you've ever heard, he called it Southern Cambodian, but it was a whole special sort of thing. And so he was not a follower of Christ. He went through high school, started this business. He owned He was an accountant for a while. I think he worked at like a gym, running all their finances. Then he started a very successful photography business. He was kind of the main game in town. Had a little studio, making good money, having a good life. He came to faith in the Lord, and a few years later, God called him to go back to Cambodia, the one place he said he'd never go. I remember listening to him through tears say, "If God has called me to go, how can I stay?" And so he sold his house and his cars, he left his business, and he went back to the one place he said he would never return, because that's where God called him to go. That's what these disciples did when they followed him. They put everything on the table. There was nothing that was held back. When the Old Testament tells us that you should have no other gods before Yahweh, when God commands us not to worship any other gods, he means that there can be nothing that would prevent us from worshiping and following him. There's no educational accomplishment, no athletic dream, no relationship, no personal choice, no feeling of independence or self-expression. Nothing can get between us and obeying Christ. If you think to yourself, if I only had blank, then I'd be happy. Or if I only had blank, then I'd be worth something. Or if I only had blank, then I could truly live a fulfilled life. That is the thing that God is saying you need to leave to follow me. Because you can't pursue that and pursue him. And so every part of our lives is touched by this. You notice they leave their jobs and they leave their families to follow Jesus. In the famous movie, The Karate Kid, I would show a clip right now, but you'll just have to use your imagination. Mr. Miyagi, in the original one, the better one, the far superior one, is teaching Daniel-san how to learn karate, but he's teaching him by making him do all these house chores. Now, I don't really think it works that way. Paint up, paint down, wax on, wax off. I think there's some sanding involved. He's basically just making him fix his house. The same thing happens in the remake, which is with Jackie Chan and Jaden Smith, right? Which is hilarious because he teaches him Kung Fu, but they call it the Karate Kid. Doesn't really make sense because it should be Kung Fu Kid, but whatever. But he teaches him to put his jacket on and pick something up and all this kind of stuff. And the idea is that all these everyday things that you're doing are a part of this bigger thing of karate. Or in Jackie Chan's words, he says, Kung Fu is everything. And it's like a very powerful moment. You're like, I can learn Kung Fu because I put my jacket on too. But the idea is, he says, Kung Fu flows through everything. That's his kind of mantra. Well, in a very real sense, discipleship is everything. That there's no part of your life that goes untouched from the call to follow Jesus. That too many of us have segmented Christianity into a day of the week, or a summer on staff, or a Bible study once a week, or a few moments each day. And we forget that Jesus is Lord of everything. He's Lord of our computers and our colleges. He's Lord of our relationships and our families. He's Lord of our careers. He's Lord of everything. He's not just one of the priorities on your list of priorities, but he's the page on which your priorities are written. That there's not a square inch in all of human existence over which Christ does not claim ownership. And if his lordship is as wide as creation, then the Christian mission, the call to follow, is equally as wide as creation. I think the amazing thing to me is not just that the disciples left their jobs and their families. That is absolutely amazing. But the picture here is that everything that was theirs, they laid at the feet of Jesus. That by following him, they gave him everything. So God might be calling you to leave your career and follow him, to move to a new city and follow him. But he's also calling you to be a fully committed disciple where you are. That everything you do fits under the rubric of discipleship. Now, we can sort of spiritualize that in one sense. I mean, like, well, I'm just being a disciple here in this sinful thing that I'm doing. No. What it's saying is that no second of your day can escape the question, how is Jesus calling me to follow him in this? No moment of your life can escape that question. How is Jesus calling me to follow him? And no matter what, no matter where, Jesus is worth following. And we see that in what these men gave up. What did they leave? They left their nets. They're called fishermen. Their identity, their livelihood is in this job. If their house is destroyed, as long as they have their nets and their boats, they can make more money and get a new house. As long as they have this idea of being fishermen, that they can still make it. So for them to leave that, they're saying this person, Jesus, who is calling me, is worth more than that, worth more than my identity, worth more than my safety, worth more than my livelihood. I'm laying it all on the line to follow him. I'm relying totally and completely on him. One of my favorite missionaries is Adoniram Judson. He took the gospel to Burma, sometimes called Myanmar now. And when he was graduating seminary in Boston, he received an offer to be an associate pastor or an assistant pastor at a pretty well-established church in Boston. And so his mom and his sister were super happy that he could come live at home with them. He would make good money. He could do what he wanted to do. And here's what he responded to them. When they were so excited, he shook his head and said, "My work is not here. God is calling me beyond the seas. To stay here, even to serve God in his ministry, I feel would be only partial obedience, and I could not be happy in that." And I know that if you read the rest of his story, when he goes to Burma, he experiences a civil war there. The British and the Burmese are fighting. He gets imprisoned during that time. He loses 2 children to disease. His wife dies. He goes through severe depression. In the first 7 years of his ministry, he only sees 1 convert. So that he left a comfortable gig for that. But because of his faithfulness to follow God, by the time of his death, he had translated the New Testament into the native language. 50,000 people had come to faith. Today, 600,000 Baptists are in Burma because of Adoniram Judson, because he didn't take a sweet gig in Boston. The call to follow also results in our transformation. Look at what he says. He says, "Follow me," verse 19, "and I will make you fishers of men." Now, first of all, this is a sweet dad joke, right? Jesus has great jokes because he's playing with this pun. You're a fisherman, I'm going to make you fishers of men, right? Some of us would roll our eyes, but I love that Jesus can have puns. I think he has a funnier sense of humor based on some of the things he says in Scripture. But he says, look, I'm going to make you into something. When I call you to follow me, I don't want this to be passive. This is going to be an active thing. You're going to change. You have a new job. You were a fisherman. Now you're going to go fish for men. I mean, I do think that would be sort of funny for people to take the Bible literally and just like going down the street, just tossing nets on people, you know? Like I can see us right now just like with super soakers, like baptized in the name of the Father, you know, like just going for it. But everything about their life changes, right? They understood what it meant to catch fish. Now they have a more significant task to catch people. Hudson Taylor, another missionary to China, said the Great Commission, the command to go and make disciples, is not an option to be considered. It is a command to be obeyed. Charles Spurgeon put it this way. He said, every Christian is either a missionary or an imposter. Have you met an imposter before? We all pose about certain things in our lives at some point or another. But when I was in seminary, I worked at this phenomenally reputable hotel called the Velvet Cloak Inn. Yes, it's exactly as shady as it sounds, but they paid the bills, so we were happy with it. But for a little while, this girl worked with me, this lady, this woman. Her name was Rachel. And have you ever met someone who's a one-upper? So this is an intense level of one-upsmanship. Like if I said, hey, I'm in seminary to be a preacher, she would be like, oh yeah, I've preached at a Billy Graham crusade. You're like, well, I think you took that to a level that's probably not believable. You know, if you said, hey, I want to be like a professor, she'd be like, oh yeah, I've written 7 books. If you said, I want to go on a weekend hike, then she's climbed Mount Everest. If you said you played middle school basketball, then she definitely dunked over Michael Jordan in the NBA. She's just one of those people that everything she said, like looking at her and then looking at like what she said didn't match up. Well, for us as Christians, if we say we love Jesus, we believe the Bible, and we are not about making disciples, then we're hypocrites. We're imposters. We're fakes. And that's why I think this idea of it, we don't need new information. We need to obey what we already know. You already know that your life should be about making disciples. So all the other unknowns you have about your life, you can pray about, you can ask counsel about, you can make the best decision you want. But you know you should be making disciples. So if you're not doing that, you are being disobedient. And I think the image of catching fish is particularly instructive in the way we make disciples. Two things that I just notice from this metaphor of fishing for men. The first is this: if you want to catch fish, you have to get out on the water. You can't stay in your house and dream about catching fish. You can't pray about catching fish. You can't strategize about catching fish. You actually got to get in the boat, toss your net over the side to catch some fish. So often, as Christians, we say we're about discipleship, then everything we do segments us from the fish we're trying to catch. Jesus didn't isolate himself from the culture. He showed up. He actually took the longest mission trip any of us could ever imagine from heaven to earth. He became a human being so that he could serve to the point of death. We're not called to live in a Christian bomb shelter, but to get right up next to the dark, and sometimes get up next to the difficult and maybe disgusting elements of society so that we can proclaim the message of the gospel. It's difficult, but that's where God has called us to go. And so if we're going to catch fish, we have to get out in the water, but also if you're going to catch fish, you need to catch them before you clean them. I heard a pastor say that once. It stayed with me ever since. This idea, we need to make sure, we should expect that this worship service should start getting a little messy. That people are going to show up who haven't been exposed to the gospel, who don't really understand how they're supposed to behave in church. They don't know the protocol for what it's like to be here. But that's good. That means we're catching the right kind of people. People don't need to get their lives together before they can follow Jesus. They don't need to make a certain amount of money. They don't need to go through certain stages of life before they can come to Christ. God has called us to catch fish. But here's the beautiful part of it. He says, you need to be fishers of men. But look at what he says right before that in verse 19. He says, follow me and I will make you. I will make you fishers of men. I will do the thing in you that I'm calling you to do. Because we hear, okay, God, follow you and become fishers of men. That seems too big. That seems too scary. I mean, just in our neighborhood alone, only just a half a mile away, I think it was last night, there was a shooting where there were 7 people shot or something like that. I mean, close to some of the sites that you guys are at this summer. Not far at all. And you go like, I don't know. What am I supposed to do with that, God? How am I supposed to interact with this place? God, what you've asked me to do is bigger than I can do on my own, and that's perfect. Because Jesus says, I will make you fishers of men. St. Augustine said, grant what you command and command what you will. His point is this: God, if you call me to it, you just have to make it happen. Where Jesus calls, he bridges the widest gulf. Wherever Jesus calls you to go, whatever he calls you to do, he will supply the grace and the energy and the faith necessary to obey. He will make you into what he is calling you to be. Philippians 1:2 and Philippians 1:6, Paul says, he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. He'll finish it. In Philippians 2:12 and 13, he said, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. God is calling you to work out your salvation in the real world, but he's the one working in you to make it happen. Don't fall into the trap of thinking because God requires something of you that he will not also empower you to accomplish it. Have you ever showed up to a test in school that you were woefully unprepared for? It is a terrible feeling. It is an awful feeling to read a question and go, I have no idea what this is supposed to be, right? If you do the multiple choice, the teacher's like, did you intentionally guess wrong? Because statistically, you should have had a higher grade if you guessed right. Right? When you just don't know. This is like God calling us to take a test, and then he's right there giving us the answers the whole way. That he's whispering over your shoulder in like a non-cheating sort of way, the answers to the test. You and I are as dependent on the grace of God to fulfill the mission of God as we are for salvation. And God is just as faithful and powerful to strengthen and empower us to accomplish his work as he is to save us. The same God who's able to take you from death to life is the same God who's able to make you a disciple maker. If you would just get out of the boat and follow him, allow him to shape you and mold you into what he's trying to make you. Jesus, here's the cool thing about it. Jesus never calls us to do something he hasn't done either. It's a truth of discipleship. When you disciple someone, you'll find it is very hard to take someone where you are not willing to go. Well, Jesus has gone everywhere. He stepped out of heaven to earth. He took on flesh. He was not in a position of power, but a position of humility. He served to the point of death, even death on the cross. None of us will go anywhere that Christ calls us that he hasn't also gone himself. Discipleship is walking in the footsteps of Jesus in the power of the Spirit, obeying the plan of God, and every step following Jesus is worth it. Jesus is worth following. He is worth it all. Jesus asked this question in Mark 8, for what does it benefit you to gain the whole world but lose your soul? Think about just Peter, for example, who's mentioned here. The first and last thing Jesus said to Peter, I don't know if you know this, the very first words and the very last words he said to Peter were, follow me. Very beginning of his ministry and after Peter denied him. And in the middle is a whole life of discipleship. Ups and downs, moments where he is brave and bold, and moments where he doubts, moments where he acts rashly, without thinking, and moments where he's scared to act at all. In every one of those steps, Jesus is with him. What does it look like for you to follow Jesus today? For some that you will share with this week, the first thing you have to do is believe that this is the first time when I talk to people here in Philly, there are times when I share with them and this is the first time they've heard Jesus' call to follow him. But maybe, more likely I think in this group, you believe but you're struggling to walk in the path of Jesus. Would you today be able to say, Jesus is worth it? He is the only one who is worth following. If I have nothing except Jesus, then I still have everything. That you can have everything the world has, but if you don't have Jesus, you have nothing. Can you say, Jesus, I will follow you?